And we are live. This is the live episode of the Unsolicited Response Show, the September ICS Security Month in Review, where we're going to go over 3 top stories, wins, fails, and predictions. Just a quick note before I bring Joel on, my guest for this month. The S4X22 agenda came out last Friday. You can see it at s4xevents.com. Really looking good. We've got almost the entire stage 2 agenda, just a few spots held out for late breaking things, and probably 80% of the main stage agenda up. I do really appreciate the 240 people who bought tickets on faith. They've been to past S4s. They believed it would be great. But I also believe it's important to, when people are going to spend their time and money considering going to an event, I think it's important early on to tell them what they're going to see. Agenda is up. We also announced the Women in ICS Security Wednesday. All the women can come free. There's going to be a social event. We've got a lot of things planned there. And I'm just really excited. We've got a lot of announcements of things surrounding S4. While the agenda is great, we do know when people attend events, they attend to mix with their other peers and do things outside that they just can't do, quite frankly, over a computer in a virtual event. So we're really stressing those for S4X22. So check it out. With that, I want to get right to the show. Liz, can you bring Joel on? My co-host for this episode, not even, I wouldn't even call him a guest since we're going to have more of a discussion here on the top 3 stories, is Joel Langill. He now has a new training institute, the ICS Cyber Security Institute. You also might know Joel as a SCADA hacker. He's been doing training for years. He comes to this from the opposite side. Joel comes from an engineering background, working for a long time in refineries and then moving into security, whereas a lot of us in this industry came from security and are learning about operations. So that usually leads to some fun discussions. So Joel, with all that, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Dale. Glad to be here. And also really looking forward to seeing everybody again in January when we all converge in Miami Beach.
Yes, that will be fun. Now, for those of you out there, we will be taking your questions and comments. You can put those in the chat, and Joel and I will see them. Producer Liz will put up some pertinent comments and questions that we see. So we would like your input, particularly your wins, fails, and predictions. I'm always curious what people thought worked and didn't work for the month. But let's get right into the first issue. That is, Joel, in July, the Biden administration issued a national security memorandum on ICS, critical infrastructure ICS, and part of that was they were tasked, CISA was tasked with coming up with a critical infrastructure control system cybersecurity performance goals and objectives. With a very short window, they had to come out in September. I think they beat their date by 1 day, so they did get them out. And if I was just to characterize them, they're very broad. For example, I wrote one down here. One of them was ensure that cybersecurity is considered when new control systems are designed, developed, deployed, and updated. Another example was employ documented change management rules and procedures. And I'd encourage people, we'll include a link in the show notes, but I'd encourage people to look at these. But Joel, you've had a chance to look at them. What was your reaction to the document and maybe the impact you think this will or will not have?
Well, we can kind of look at this twofold. So, I take a look at how DHS chooses to handle these. And again, if you look at the overall organizational structure of these, with the goals and objectives, you really don't see a lot new. It's the same core topics that are just presented in a slightly different manner. But the problem I see is that, again, they're depending on a core set of documents that may not be the answer in all cases. Because, again, we start looking at the objectives. The first objective, and obviously the thing that I always put as a high priority, is the concepts of risk management. And then they associate governance with it. You look at risk management, and again, they start throwing out things like the NIST risk management framework. And having personally been involved in RMF within the government space, primarily in Department of Defense, unfortunately, that's not cutting it. It becomes more of a checkpoint compliance aspect rather than really looking at the core of risk. And, Ralph Wagner made this comment a couple years back where he similarly followed the theory that when they put the onus on a risk management process without failing to really understand and communicate how that should take place, it seems like we're always going to start off and get into the same rut. So I think it's a good idea. The overall structures is well suited. The problem's going to be back to governance without, the informative text that helps people understand what's really required here is always going to cause us to stall and probably not get the results that we would expect.
Yeah, I want to hit a couple of things you said there, because my biggest reaction was almost your first comment on this, and sort of at the end, what do they expect people to do with this? We already had the NIST CSF, right? The cybersecurity framework with 5 functions and a bunch of subcategories and references and such. We have NIST SP 882. In their actual announcement of this, they had links to about 8 different documents that CISA had put out recently that said, these are the things you should do. So if I'm an asset owner, which one am I supposed to look at? Do you want me to do the NIST CSF? Do you want me to do this one? There's so many things they're putting out there that, to their credit, I wrote this, they're highly correlated. So it's not like they're fighting each other. They tend to, some are leaving some things off, some have more detail, but they're somewhat correlated. But I really don't know as an asset owner what I'm supposed to do. I don't understand. Do they expect people to still use the CSF? Are they saying, no, throw the CSF away, now use this? I mean, do you have any feeling on that? Or do you have any feeling of which of all those documents you like best?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, this goes so many ways, and I do agree with Richard's comment, is that unfortunately they give a lot of reference and context around what we're supposed to do, but they completely lack the execution and how to do it. But then I read some things and I just go, really? Most people know that I don't have a lot of respect for DHS when it comes to telling me how to operate an LNG facility. And now all of a sudden they want to start doing this. So I look at one of the objectives is configuration and change management. You read the objectives and it's like, really? Do you not realize that we've been implementing change management for process control for decades? So it's nothing new. But then they kind of just take this and they, rather than look at it from a holistic system approach, they come in and they start to make it more information technology centric, like documenting network traffic flows. That's great. I completely agree that understanding your normal traffic patterns is important, but they don't tell people how to do that. And it seems that, okay, you can spend a lot of money to buy a tool to do that. Great. Or maybe you could start teaching people in your great training facility up in Idaho Falls how to do that and start to work towards addressing more of the operational skills that they lack rather than putting more paper on the table. Because I know I looked at the same list of the documents that they posted up there. And again, it's funny that they only reference their own work. And there's so many great documents out there that I wish they would specifically reference more definitively. And I know they do have some footnotes to like 62443, which is a wonderful set, but they still don't seem to want to embrace documentation that they didn't create.
I might differ with you a little bit on the document in terms of specificity. I mean, one thing, if I had to say the thing I liked most about the document was every recommendation had an audit statement. Now that audit statement was very high level, like have a change management policy. So it wasn't like giving you the details you want, but I thought that was good. I I think there are places for high-level documents that just are saying, hey, you should have these elements to your program, and we're not going to jump in and tell you exactly how to do each one of these. That bothers me a little less than you. Again, it's you need that somewhere, but this document could have just referenced other documents and rather trying to recreate it. I guess the problem I had was my biggest issue with this document was I thought the cybersecurity framework was a good approach. And I thought it was getting some mind share. We were getting various vertical industries like API 1164 pointed to it. Some of the DOE stuff pointed to it. You had manufacturing target profiles. It was kind of like this coalescing document that everyone said, okay, we are going to at least speak this language. Now they could modify the security controls, which was one of the power of the document. It didn't say every industry has to do the same thing or every user has to do the same thing. But now, to me, this just cuts the legs out of the CSF. I mean, if I'm an asset owner, I say, well, the government is telling me this is the direction the regulation is going to come. This is what they're telling me is most important. So, I mean, you can comment on that, or if you had any other thoughts on it, feel free to jump in.
Well, no, I definitely think that that's worth discussion, because what's I find really interesting is, they just came out with this second directive, and of course it's not being made available to the public. And well, it's nice that they're finally starting to do that, but in the end, the public's going to have to probably start to see it in some form, because third parties like myself are going to be involved in helping companies address their implementation of it. But I would look at a lot of the text that they put together, like that report from the GAO. I mean, when I read that document and I come to this, this overview of this process that they created, you could almost go back and look at CFATs and replace CFATs with transportation around pipelines, and it reads the same. The process is the same. The way they want to do this is the same. And you're kind of going, here we go again. It's more of the same process that we kind of saw in the past didn't work well because the organization didn't involve themselves. And again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I just don't see TSA as a cyber entity. They really haven't had that capability. So if it's just going to be TSA pawning everything off to CISA, it's great, but why don't they at least then move it and get it out of TSA? Because then we're going to start to have this interorganizational conflict, and I'm not in favor of that. And again, I completely agree with where you're coming from. We have good processes. The framework is a wonderful document. I personally like it because it is a framework, and you can apply any standard you want underneath it, which is the way it should be. So they're kind of confusing things by not using the framework and then tailoring it, assisting the transportation sector and subsectors to tailor it to their needs. And I don't know how we're going to see the step change we need. We'll have to wait and see, I guess.
Ronnie, thanks for that link. Appreciate that. And Liz, you need to put up all the comments, like when someone says absolutely true, great question, Dale. Those are the kind of really important comments to put up. Anything that praises Joel and I. I want to talk about the TSA thing is my fail for the month. But I had one other comment on this. Well, actually a couple others. One thing that I was shocked of is they had enhanced objectives. And one of the enhanced objectives was implement multi-factor authentication for remote access. So this was one of the ones where they get prescriptive. And I would have thought, after everything we've seen on these incidents, that would have been, to me, that would have almost been one of the first things to do. Like if you were going to say, hey, there's 5 things to do, it would have been in that list of 5, just because we see that's where the failure keeps coming in. But I guess with the TSA thing, to me, that was just awful. I mean, just terrible. It finally leaked out. I don't know if you saw it, Joel. You were coming back from Singapore, but the Wall Street Journal got a copy of it and published it the other day. So we actually see it. And this was in response to the Colonial Pipeline incident. And it's just a scattershot. You can imagine it was just some people with some security knowledge getting in a room and say, what should we put on here? I mean, they actually had email security, phishing and internet access. They had DNS protection. My favorite, telling you to turn off Microsoft Office macros. I mean, it was just this list of incoherently organized things that they just threw at the pipeline industry and said, here's a bunch of things you should do. I mean, and also TSA is part of DHS. You know, they knew all this was coming out. They knew all this already had come out. Why did they just start from scratch with this list? I mean, I don't know what the pipeline owner operators, I guess you have to answer the mail, but to me, that's actually one of the worst things the government has put out in the last 5 years, in my mind. I don't know if you've had much of a chance to look at it in the Wall Street Journal, but some of the things on that list, I was like, what were they thinking?
Well, no, I mean, I completely agree that everything that I'm seeing, it's, you know, let's be blunt, it's a knee-jerk reaction that gets something because a deadline was made to have them create documents, and they probably aren't the best suited individuals to create those documents. They throw this stuff together, and that's why I do every one of the components that I've looked at so far around what they started to push out following Colonial. It's just the same stuff, and that's why I kind of laugh. Chris is in here making some comments. I think it's an insult to believe that these companies don't do some of the basic things that they're saying, and again, it's like. Really, on two-factor, was it really necessary to state that? I mean, how many documents do we need that puts that high on the list? Or we could just go down the list on and on. So far, it's obviously assuming that people must be doing absolutely nothing at all, and I can't believe that's the case. So I wish they would have put together a document that was really based on actuals and kind of correlated what they're seeing from actual events and then create what I would consider a best-in-class guidance rather than here's somebody that's never done cybersecurity in their life, follow these 25 steps and you're going to be great. And you kind of go, I don't think so. I really don't think so. So
yeah.
I correlate what's going on now with transportation to the early days in versions 1, 2, and 3 of SIP. We went through the same learning process. They put together documents like the best one I saw with SIP in the early versions was what they defined as a vulnerability assessment. It had nothing to do with vulnerabilities. It's somebody wrote it that probably didn't quite understand what that meant and the breadth of what we're trying to do by understanding weaknesses within architectures and components. So that's why it's going to take a while. And I don't think they're given the companies credit. And again, it's interesting how they combine pipelines and LNG facilities. Those are two very different entities. And now it's going to be interesting to see how the majors, with all the LNG activity we've seen over the recent years, it's going to be interesting to see how they jump in and kind of say, we're way beyond this. And the way that we're securing our infrastructure is way beyond this crap that's being sent to us.
Yeah. Well, if I set aside that TSA document just because it should just go away. They should just say, oops, we made a mistake. Let us try draft 3. But I think my last comment on the performance goals and objectives would be they weren't bad if they were coming out in a vacuum. And if CISA says this is our new approach and all this other stuff is just reference material that we may reference before, but we're going down this path and we're going to put meat on those bones. We're going to start to point to specific standards and specific processes for change control. Well, in that case, I could I could say, okay, this is not a bad starting point. It had a nice structure. It covered most of the things of a program. It wasn't a bad document. It's just in the midst of all these other documents, I don't know what it means. And I guess that would be my suggestion to CISA would be, tell us what the road is going to look like. Is this the start of a new road and you're passing on the old road? Is this going to link into the old road? What's the plan here is what I would say. Do you have any last thought, or you want to move on to the next topic?
No, I think we've covered it, and I really do appreciate some of these comments that are in here. I couldn't agree more with Ronnie. It seems that we do need to take the next step, and I'm not a fan of over-regulation, because the more you regulate, the more people will say, we did what you told us to do. Now what? And this is kind of back when we started doing this in the early part of the Obama administration. You have to be careful, because the more you push, the more people will just say, fine, we'll do it your way. And then when something bad happens, they'll go in front of Congress and say, we did it the way you told us to do it. So how can we be held responsible and accountable?
Yeah, put that comment from Ronnie back up, Liz, if you could. The guidance versus enforcement, education versus regulation. I think that it's always important when you put out a document like this to actually be clear as to what it's supposed to be done. What's the use of this? And I'm not saying they did a terrible job on that. They were tasked with performance goals and objectives, which would mean, to me, this is a guidance document. But is this going down the path, the regulatory path? I think that's something else that they could do very clearly with these documents. I mean, the TSA document is clearly something people are going to be audited on. These are requirements. This document, I'm not sure what this means. Is this just one of many educational documents or something? But that would be another area where they could be clearer.
Completely agree.
Okay, let's move to topic number 2. And then, by the way, people, topic number 3, Joel and I are going to definitively determine who should do what in OT after some discussions in Singapore. So that'll be a fun one. But the second one is, and this one might not be too much because neither Joel or I are insurance people, but I thought this was important. So Moody's, they're the company that's famous for the credit ratings, AAA all the way down to C. And they decided that there was a business case to come up with cybersecurity ratings and began an effort to do that. They teamed with Team8 back in 2019. Team8 is the Israeli kind of VC incubator who actually started Clarity and a few other companies. They teamed with them. They created a company called Visible Risk. Just looking at my timeline here. They invested Moody's did another $25 million in March 2021 into this Visible Risk, again, with the goal to create cyber security ratings for companies for a variety of reasons. But then they pretty much abandoned that in September. Nothing ever came out that I saw from Visible Risk, and they instead sold Visible Risk to BitSight and then invested $250 million in Visible Risk at a valuation of $2.5 billion. So that's a pretty big company. And now BitSight is listed in Moody's blog as their cybersecurity data and analytics partner for the future. So it sounds like they worked for a couple of years. They didn't really make a lot of progress. They decided to pull the plug and get their rating information from this company called BitSight. And I guess, Joel, I found that interesting because it is a hard problem, just to somehow efficiently and accurately come up with a cyber risk rating from a company without spending a man year investigating all different parts of the company. So I guess I'd ask you 2 questions. One is, do you think a cyber risk rating is possible? And 2, do you think it is of value?
This is a great question, and I'm really glad that we can at least share a little bit on this.
Yeah.
So I want to flash back to about 2010, 2011. I was introduced to a team. I was working with Waterfall Security, And at that time, there was a push to try to start to do a very similar process with Zurich. Zurich is one of the largest global insurers for catastrophic events. So all the major entities, I mean, this is to handle, the multi-billion dollar type insurance policies for significant events. So we started presenting and preparing all this data to try to create this exact same model that Moody's is trying to do. And so it's really interesting. Moody's didn't do their homework and find out that, 10, 12 years ago, the exact same flare out occurred. After about 18 months, Zurich realized that they could not quantify a company's security rating or security posture. There's just too many variables. And where in this complex architecture do you actually draw the line? So Zurich said, though it's a great idea, we have to be able, since we're in the insurance business, right? And the actuarial experts will come in and they want everything to be well defined in a numerical sense. There was no way for them to compare company A and company B, even within the same sector, because they were focusing on a single sector back then. But now you start to, how would you compare JB Meats to Schneider Trucking? And again, I use local companies because we both have JBS up in Green Bay and Schneider's global headquarters is in Green Bay. But you look at that, how would you ever compare those two? And in order to do insurance, you need to be able to create, it's just like everybody with their automobile insurance. If you're very accident prone, you're going to pay a lot more in insurance than a good, clean, safe, healthy driver. So that's why I don't think they're going to come to some baseline that'll really make this work, because there's no measurement. Now, is it valuable? I absolutely think it would be. So let's kind of try to take a look at how the governments handled this, which is what they did with 171 and the protection of controlled unclassified information and this whole CMMC process to try to get companies along still very qualitative measures, but to provide them some security baseline in order for them to classify what type of infrastructure they would have access to, and in turn they would need in order to have access to those infrastructures. So I think it's valuable. I really do. But from an operational perspective, the one thing, if and again, I'm no actuarial expert, I don't know how you would do it. So cyber insurance against operational technology. So would that cover the ransom that you would pay if you were hit with ransomware? Would it cover the mechanical damage that occurred because, well, let's just use our good friends in Iran? Would it cover the replacement of the centrifuges that were damaged as a result of the cyber attack? It's very complex, and that's why as you start to quantify an impact to an industrial control system on a true manufacturing or process could be extremely costly, and that's where I think it's going to be hard to get that quantified.
Wow, a lot there. And by the way, I do have, I'm interviewing for the show later this month 2 cyber insurance experts, so I'm very curious. I have a lot of questions for them. In terms of where it could be used, obviously for insurance, right? You could get a different rate based on your rating, your cyber risk rating. I could see it being useful for investors. They use credit risk ratings to determine the company's financial posture. This could affect the investment community. Business partners, acquisitions, even your own governance. It gives the board some quick snapshot. How are we doing according to the world in this area? So I think the value is, as you said, Joel, is pretty easy to see where this could be valuable. BitSight actually does this today. So Moody's bought a company that actually does this. Now, they don't publish, as far as I could see on their site, these ratings like Moody's does with the credit ratings. But I looked a little bit at it. They look at things like attack surface. So how much of your attack surface is exposed? Like I ran S4XEvents.com through it, and we scored a 740, which was between good and excellent. But there's not much going on our website. We don't do any e-commerce or anything like that, so I'm not surprised. There's questionnaires, and I think that's the biggest thing that most organizations, when they're looking at creating these ratings, they create questionnaires. So they're doing it. It's just a question of what is the fidelity of that, and what happens when they make a dramatic mistake, because that does happen in the credit rating. Sometimes a company with a great credit rating goes bust. They do make these big mistakes, but they could make them. Ronnie was acting about acts of war in insurance. I mean, that's a huge issue. They're playing around a lot with insurance rules and regulations now. One of the things, Joel, to your point, one of the things that caught up some of the insurers was they had all causes language for physical damage. So it could be a fire, it could be, it could be employee error, it could be bad part, it could be all sorts of things. They didn't really think it could be a cyber attack. So for a while, physical damage from a cyber attack was actually covered by most people's insurance. Now, since they've gotten smarter, they've started to write exemptions to that, so that's no longer covered. But I guess my biggest question for this effort is, what kind of fidelity can they actually achieve at what level of effort? I think that balance is really going to determine how effective this is. And I'm quite frankly fascinated with it, but I don't know how good they can get this rating in the next 2 years.
Well, yeah, because one way I kind of see the questions that I would have is, especially as we bring in operational technologies, if it's done through a survey, so I think immediately of CSET. CSET's a really nice tool. It does a really good job, but just because you say something doesn't actually mean you're doing something. So I tend to like to use CSET as a early engagement tool to kind of make the client team aware of what kind of issues and policies and procedures we're going to be looking at, and then to kind of validate what they say, because it's one thing when you're sitting in a room with corporate level people answering questions the way they perceive the answers should be versus going down several layers to a physical facility. So take a multinational company. It's one thing to use what they say at headquarters versus what you actually see when you go to the plants that may be in Texas or may be in China. And that's where I see what is and what is perceived are probably not very close right now. I can't believe that people have that head to toe, top to bottom deployment of a consistent policy right now. There's just too many variables. And again, we all hope for it, but proof hasn't ever shown that to be the case.
But let's flip this on its head. I bet if I said, Joel, I'm going to give you a half day to go into this facility and tell me whether its security posture rating is A, B, C, D, E, or F. So 1 through 5. I'm very confident you could do that in a half day. Even though you wouldn't know it all, you would just, because I'm sure when you walk into an asset owner, you know pretty quickly whether, where they are on the maturity cycle and what's going on. Even without doing a bunch of scans or walking everything down, you can just tell. Not that you're never wrong, or I would never be wrong, but I'd be pretty confident with like a 90% confidence I could nail the grade on a level of 1 to 5 in a half day. So that's kind of the flip side. If I feel like people in the industry can do that, then maybe it's not so impossible.
Well, I agree with you, but there's a couple variants on this. So that was what was really nice about the last Friday in Singapore, is that's kind of what I did. Was brought into one of their utilities, and we did some high-level security reviews, architecture reviews. And We did. It's exactly how I started it. Based on this, is if this is really what you're doing, I would give you this grade, and again, pretty much on a 1 to 5 scale. And if you make these improvements to it, we would raise you up to this second grade. The problem I think with that is, I could do it, you could do it, but would we come up with the same grade? Because we're both going to go in with our own idea of how we would score based on criticality. And that's where I think the big problem is that that's very, very subjective. You know, I'm an operational guy, so I'm going to focus on operational criticality, where somebody else might come in and look at, you know, system level criticality. And that's where I think the greatest challenge would be.
Well, I think that's a great segue to the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, because you said something at the Singapore CSA OTCEP that really, really stuck in my mind. And it was around the concept of OT and your definition of OT. And definitions are scary things. Well, maybe scary is the wrong word. They're difficult things. I personally don't think there's a lot of value in fighting over general definitions of general items. For example, cyber hygiene. A couple of years ago, I did a whole podcast on, hey, you can't say every good practice security control is cyber hygiene. Washing your hands is, but getting blood tests is not hygiene. And we've seemed to essentially right now, cyber hygiene is implementing and maintaining a large set of good practice security controls. Now, I hate that definition, but that's what the world thinks it is. So, I don't fight that anymore. I don't think we're quite there yet with OT, where everyone agrees. In some cases, it is just another word, a replacement word for ICS. That's what I think its most common usage is. Sometimes it's everything from layer 3 and below. You had a different definition. But I think maybe more important than that, actually, it was funny. I had a call yesterday with a vendor who thought OT was everything level 1 and below, which I hadn't heard before. But before we could talk, I had to understand what they were saying with OT. So what is, I think, more important is this issue of who should be doing what in the environment. Let's say, and anything that is level 3 and below, anything that isn't on the enterprise, that is in operations. And when you were defining OT, I thought you were, in Singapore, you were talking about it being even things such as coming up with control strategies and programming logic and creating displays and all that. Is that something that you consider to be OT, that level of work?
Well, that's a good point. And one thing I do want to say is I hope we come back and talk a little bit about what Richard just posted on the comment section. But I'm interested to hear how, people like Chris jump in on this. But to me, there's this kind of convolution that's occurring on the definition of OT to try to create a one-to-one similarity with IT. To me, I think we all agree that operational technologies are the components, the systems associated with running a cyber physical situation. I hate to say process because I'm definitely, you can see by my backdrop, I'm always thinking about that industry, but let's talk about making automobiles or something else. So the operational technology comprises those systems, and those systems could be a distributed control system or a SCADA system. So it's the system now that the OT person's responsible for. And in order for that system to do its job, not only must it be connected to a network and connected to controllers and controllers connected to sensors and actuators, but it must be properly configured and maintained from an operational perspective of the system. So here we have this system, and in most cases, it's the same person that's doing the system configuration as it is the peripheral activity of maintaining communications between human-machine interfaces or engineering workstations and servers and controllers. And when you start to look at a comprehensive threat profile, the attack surfaces all of those components. So if the attack surface includes the logic configuration or the graphic configuration within the system, they all are really part of how we address risk management from a holistic OT perspective. So, way back when, in some of the early research that people like Mark Fabro did, one great attack vector is to go in and modify graphics. And all of a sudden you change the ability of graphics to change, or you change them from being read-write targets to read-only targets and things like that. So that's why I look at it more from a control systems engineer perspective than some systems administrator. There's more to OT than administration. There is the day-to-day operations and maintenance of that equipment, which is tweaking of set points, tweaking of alarm limits, tweaking of dead bands, tweaking of control strategies.
Yeah, and I think that might be where it's a little harder to say who should be doing what when there's those different definitions. That's why when you said it in Singapore, I was like, no wonder you want engineers to be so involved. Because if you view that as part of OT, then yes, that is an engineering function. To me, there's this whole set of tasks that are involved, whether it be being the Active Directory domain admin, understanding how to run a VMware virtualization environment, the switches, the deploying operating systems, backup and recovery of computers. There's a whole set of things like that I just think it's a waste of time to try to get engineers to do that kind of work, because engineers didn't become engineers to do that kind of work. That's not really what they do. And I wonder if I guess let me go at it another way. When I look at other things outside of operations, there are software engineers, for example, who handle all the application stuff. IT does not handle the actual application that might be used in e-commerce or such. They might provide the platform, they might keep it up and running, they might back it up, but they're not making any changes at all to that. Or if you're looking at like a financial trading application, IT doesn't get to touch that. And in fact, IT doesn't even get to do maintenance on it until that financial team says, you can do it in this time frame, and by the way, our redundant system has to be up and running, it can never go down. So I almost think that there's going to be a set of engineers that are going to need to do certain tasks in what you call OT, and your classic IT person can't go anywhere near them. But then there's going to be a set of classic tasks that IT does for every other customer with needs that you're probably not going to have a lot of engineers want to do that work. It's going to be a separate workforce. I don't know. How does that resonate with you? Do you see actually engineers needing to be the domain admins in the virtualization, VMware certified to be able to do that sort of thing?
Well, to start, I mean, there's definitely not a yes/no answer to this, because I think it's very customer driven, and how big or small the organization is, because the larger the organization, the more diversity they're going to have in the staff that they can have on board. But I think that this is a very systemic problem, because it's kind of funny. What I'm trying to do now, and it's very difficult, is to really create job function aligned with training objectives to try to build a true OT security rubric around what we do in the operation of a facility. So everything would go from an operational perspective back. So here we are, we need people to do these functions. Whether or not these functions are done by one or more persons should be irrelevant, because we still need to make sure that all of the key objectives of each one of these functions is addressed. And that's why my upbringing, we didn't have a lot of that diversity. So the control system was under my responsibility. So all of the configuration and maintenance of that was the responsibility of not only me, because I was a staff employee, but also the hourly people that supported me, which tended to be the technicians that would do the upgrades and the patching and those type of tasks, where I was more responsible for doing configuration management around the operation of the control system. So I think this is something that's the biggest challenge right now, and that's why I think from a workforce development perspective, we're way off on what's being developed as training programs versus what's needed in the workforce. And if we kind of tie it back to these overall objectives and goals that TSA, DHS pushed out, that's one thing that we're really in a huge gap in, is everybody that's associated with touching an OT system or an IT system that integrates with an OT system been through some basic level of training and awareness to make sure that they understand the risks and know how to address and observe and identify risks before they become unmanageable.
Yeah, and I guess we should point out, I probably didn't do it in the opening, but you've been doing training for decades now in this area, and you've just, I think that's some of the things you said probably drove the development of your new courses in the ICS, CSI.org, which we're going to have you on just to talk about training at some point in time.
I enjoy that.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that when the time's right for you. I think just maybe one last comment on this is I really like the way you're talking about the people doing the skill. The technology needs people with the right skills to deploy and maintain it, regardless of where they come from. And I think that's probably one of the big blind spots for a lot of asset owners. They get these sophisticated systems in now, as I said, the number of domains deployed with no domain controller experience or no domain admin experience in them. And now we're seeing beautiful VMware deployments and nobody knows anything about it, So I think that's a big thing, that you can't just deploy it and say, we're not going to touch it. If you deploy it, you got to own it. You got to have the people wherever they are. But let's shift to wins, fails, and predictions. And if you're online, I'd really like to see your wins, fails, and predictions for the month. Liz will post them up here. But Joel, I'll start with you. Do you have a win for the month?
Do I have a win for the month?
Yeah. Anything you saw that you'd classify as a win? You can pass if you don't.
Well, no, the one thing that I saw as a really big win was the work that is being done in Singapore, and the true, real close cooperation between the industry, asset owners, if you want to refer to them that, and the overseers or their cybersecurity agency. Their cooperation and working together, some of the results that have been shown have been absolutely overwhelming. I really like the progress. Now, again, we're working in a fairly small geographic area, makes it more possible, but I'm really impressed with what I've seen and hope that more entities can work together in these public-private partnerships.
Yeah, I think Singapore is an interesting laboratory for two reasons. One, the size, you say. You deal with a couple water companies, an electric utility. You can get your arms around it, right? The other thing is they, quite frankly, have a lot more authority than we do in the U.S. Direct and indirect. I mean, these companies know the partnership is not optional. That the partner says do something, they're going to do it. But I think for that reason, I agree with you on the win, and I'm really impressed by the way they're charging at this issue, that they are very proactive. My win, and I hit CISA hard on this episode, so let me give them a win. I think what they are doing with their comms, their communications, is really impressive. They came out recently with a bad practices list, and they came out with a graphic novel. Now, none of these gave necessarily new information, but just being clever and thinking, okay, how do we get people to actually absorb this information and use it? And I've hit ISA, I've hit DHS and all these organizations for just coming out with 30-page white papers, that are 100-page standards that are really hard to absorb. I thought what they've done there is good. I think CISA Jen, her Twitter feed is really good. She's been out there really pushing the message. So my win would be CISA's communication strategy, especially for non-typical communications for the last month or a couple of months. How about a fail, Joel? Any fail? Or are you going to be a nice guy?
No, I'm not going to say fail. I think it's been a pretty good month, so I'll pass on fail.
Okay. My fail I already gave, the TSA security directive. Just mind-blowing how that got out, and my condolences to the industry to have to deal with that. Hopefully they just kind of gracefully step back and say, here's Security Directive 3. It replaces Security Directive 2. So we'll see if we get there. But now I think the most fun part, predictions. Do you have a prediction? Something that might happen, let's say, in the next 1 month to 1 year? And if not, I can go first if you want a second to think.
I do want a second to think on that one.
Okay. And I'm curious what you think of my prediction. I thought, I cover the visibility and detection market space really closely, and compliance has been something they're all working on. That's kind of a done deal, compliance with the 62443 and other standards. But they've been moving into risk. And that seemed to be a big competitive area in terms of coming up with risk scores for zones, for assets, for overall organizations, as well as coming up with maybe mitigation recommendations based on that risk score to change your score from a 78 to a 71. I saw recently a Rataflow demonstration. I'm going to have them on the show pretty soon to talk about that. So that was one area I thought was going to be a major competitive area over the next 2 years. I still think it will be. But I guess my prediction is by the end of Q2 2022, I think integration of SBOMs into these visibility and detection products will be a next major feature or competition area. The SBOM has just gotten so much visibility in the last year, and it shows no sign of subsiding. So I think it's probably pretty easy for them to do to import SBOMs and add them to their vulnerability management. And so my prediction would be you'll be seeing a lot of press releases between now and the end of Q2 2022 of SBOM support and full supply chain vulnerability management in your Clarities, Nozomi, Dragos, Tenables, and all those.
I actually think that's a pretty good point. I'm very impressed with the evolution of those platforms and the ability to really start to identify kind of hidden threats that people weren't aware of or hidden risk. I kind of think my prediction is really, I'm hoping that the past year has really raised people's awareness of really the dependence on supply chain, both from cyber and physical points of view. And I'm hoping that step change is going to occur because, we're starting to see how even from a physical point of view, like the insufficient supply of chips and how it's impacting everything from automobiles to refrigerators to, desktop computing platforms. So I'm hoping that this supply chain awareness will both start to address the cyber weaknesses and their linkages, as well as the resiliency aspect. And that's where everybody's starting to throw the word resilience out. And we talked about this last week when we shared the stage, was cyber resilience. I don't like to put cyber in front of it because resilience should just be resilience. And that's where I think the supply chain, what's occurred on our supply chain and its exposure, both, like the transportation sector was hit so hard during COVID, and most of those didn't make headlines. Colonial Pipeline, of course, did. But that's why I'm hoping, and I believe in the next, it's going to take a while, but when we come back a year from now, not only the incorporation of things like SBOMs, but truly more threat mapping and understanding supply chain risk and supply chain vectors into how we start to build and secure infrastructures. Using the reference example, Dragonfly was a really good example of supply chain weaknesses and how it worked its way in. I'm hoping more and more people will start to put that as part of their overall risk management process.
Yeah, that statement you made in Singapore was great, because we were running on a panel that was based like cyber resilience or something like that, and I had expanded the topic, and you said it best. You said just throw every word before and after resilience. It is resilience regardless of the cause or the factor. I do wonder, though, one of the things is we're going to see such supply chain problems for COVID and other reasons, just the issues with ports right now. I mean, shipping something to Hawaii is literally 5 times more expensive than it was a year ago. So I wonder if just the lack of supply chain components and availability of the chain is going to kind of mute efforts on working on the security issues of it. It'll be more the other factors of resilience. Hey, we just can't expect just in time for everything. We need to have some inventory. We need to plan for these supply chain disruptions. Maybe there's some side benefit of that to cyber, but I'm a little worried that it's going to get overwhelmed by just the huge problem.
I agree, and I kind of want to add. So one thing, every morning when I'd get up, I'd look out my window and I could see the sea and near the port of Singapore. And it was shocking that over the 6 days I was there were 3 container ships fully loaded that never moved. And you're kind of like going, this problem is very widespread, very widespread. I only saw one of MSC had a ship that came in. It was in and out in a day, but I was shocked at the volume of container ships that are just sitting idle. Again, fully loaded. They were not empty ships. So I agree with you. We definitely have a significant problem awaiting us if we don't start to address it and bring this in the reverse direction.
Well, Joel, I could talk to you forever. You're always get my mind working with what your comments, but I actually have another call. I scheduled it terribly at the top of the hour. So I just want everyone to make sure they check out s4xevents.com for the S4 agenda. I hope we see you there. Liz, can you take that banner down so people can see Joel's website, icscsi.org. He's got some new training programs up, and skatehacker.com has always been kind of the repository of information. I know Joel has so much up there. I encourage people to look at that. Joel, thank you for coming on, and have a good October.
Pleasure to be with you. I appreciate it, and thank you all for attending.
Okay, bye, everybody. End broadcast.
Okay.